You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 521 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I got a lot to cover on today's show, including an important House vote on the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm going to cover more of the U.S. provocative actions against China and detail how the Libyan war is evolving and Egypt and Turkey are getting more and more involved. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the daily news roundup. Both the show and the roundup are on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you really like the show and want to support financially, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. The first story I have for today's show is in Missouri. They passed an anti-BDS law. This law is a violation of free speech, and I've talked about these in the past, but to talk about this one specifically because Missouri is my home state, and I do feel like had I lived in Missouri, this law probably would have impacted me being able to, do what I do in my life. As a day job, I work in a school, and so pretty much, if you work even in a private school, a lot of times some of the stuff you do ends up contracted with the government. And so in some of these cases, even if you're not necessarily just somebody who works in a public school, but anybody involved in the education field, it would be very hard to maintain a public position where, I'm not signed on to the BDS movement mainly because of, it's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I see sanctions as economic warfare. And as oppressive as the Israeli government is towards the Palestinians, I don't support sanctioning and collective punishment, of the people of Israel at large, because just like here, the people aren't collectively guilty for the crimes of their government. At the same time, I certainly wouldn't sign something, a contract that would essentially take away my, rights to speak out as I would like to, and, support whatever kind of movements I would like to, and make it so specific that it's this one issue where really what you're doing is marginalizing the voice of people who taking positions on the issue that are, not quite so favorable towards Israel. So, I think this is a particularly important law because, if there were more Americans attuned with this issue, I think it would impact far more lives. But, this one, I think, definitely would impact me had, I've been living in Missouri. So it's very disappointing to see that state enacting these laws. All right, so on Monday's show, me and Will covered what was going down in Portland with these, largely unmarked. Somebody did point out to me that they do wear like patches saying what team they're from or kind of what organization within the DHS or DOJ structure they're a part. But, these largely unmarked, fatigued, driving around in unmarked van, armed federal agents that have invaded and are now occupying Portland. Well, it seems to be that's expanding. So probably something we'll be covering in the future on the show as well. The Department of Homeland Security has now put out they plan to send 150 armed federal agents to Chicago. They weren't exactly specific that this would play out like it had played out in Portland, but, Trump has given statements in recent days basically saying that, hey, Portland was a trial and that we're looking at expanding this to other cities. So maybe Chicago is next. The actions here of the police are just so creepy. And look, I understand that some of these people are accused of trying to, I think, burn down a courthouse this time. And that's problematic. But, there are ways to prevent people from burning down a courthouse in the U.S. that definitely don't involve this extreme level of policing. There's a few stories that I've read recently. I think most of them covered at reason.com. Fantastic. They do a lot of good work over there. And one of those was a disabled veteran who was sentenced to 60 months in prison because he had his medical marijuana in the wrong state. This is just a complete absurdity, right? That this is even something that happens. But the whole kind of establishment apparatus in the United States agrees that marijuana, has to be illegal in a lot of places, and that somehow I'm sure there's still people who believe it in gateway drug. Even Joe Biden won't, commit to legalizing it should he beat Trump in 2020. And so, very innocent people who do nothing wrong, are no harm to society, and, who are just getting high are going to, continue to go to jail. And it's especially so unfortunate when so many of the elites in the country, partake in, using different substances and are, a part of illegal activities themselves, a lot of times worse than using illegal substances. Yet, it remains a really punishable crime for people who don't have any kind of, privileges in this country of being connected to the wealthy and the elite. A Michigan man had his home stolen by the, I guess, county. It's Oakland County, so not in California, but in Michigan, for $8 and I think 18 cents in unpaid property taxes. So obviously this is absurd. You couldn't even, if you're trying to pay him a fair price for it, you probably couldn't even annex his mailbots for $18 or $8.18, worth of property. Yet they took his whole house. And then apparently he scored what they're calling a victory in court after the court ends up ruling that Michigan has to, I guess, compensate him for his house. So he doesn't even get his home back or anything like that. They just have to pay him for the value of the home minus $8.18. Or whatever other fines, I guess, they get to rack up and claim were a part of this process. They probably didn't get enough money for the house, and, the guy is going to be poor for it, and just, shows what a joke our criminal justice system is. Another story from Michigan, I'm not sure why that's so crazy going on right there now. I'll have to ask Will on the next show what's happening to the water in Michigan other than in Flint. This one, though, is a judge sentenced a 15-year-old girl who I guess was on probation for something or another to go to juvenile hall during the COVID pandemic because she wasn't doing her schoolwork online. This is, without a doubt, one of the greatest abuses, that I've heard of, for a juvenile to be sent, to juvenile hall during the COVID epidemic, when it may not be the case that the breakout is as bad as everybody's saying, but certainly in the U.S. prisons where, people don't get enough care, and even in these juvenile centers, which may be a couple degrees, marginally better than an actual jail when it comes to this, it still isn't a great place to be. And I'm sure, the judge is part of the overall consensus of Americans that believe the coronavirus is a huge pandemic. So, they think they could be sacrificing this girl. You can't socially distance in one of these places. They think they could be sacrificing her all for not doing her homework at 15 years old. It's completely absurd. I'm sure that this girl will be less likely to do her homework in the future. She will, probably end up just dropping out. Will, kind of say, F it. If I can't, not do my homework without going to jail, I just won't have any homework to do, and set her on a worse course for life rather than better. I believe this was even looked at by a judge again, and they upheld this same rule. It's absolutely insane that, you would condemn somebody for not doing their schoolwork. There was, it looks like, an important House vote on the National Defense Authorization Act. This was on the floor of the House for an amendment that would prohibit the Trump administration, or I guess any president, from carrying out a nuclear weapons test. So to stay essentially within the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which the U.S. isn't actually like a signed treaty member of, but at the same time has kind of upheld and said that we go by the guidelines in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty there. So good sign that the House is willing to take this stand. Now, I think for those of you who have listened to the show for more than a year, or for those of you who have listened the whole time, know that, we get some good stuff in the NDAs at time, but then by the time it goes to conference committee with the Senate bill, whatever comes out is a complete piece of warmongering garbage. So while this is good, and it looked like it passed by not a huge margin, but it got some Republican support and didn't have the entire, Republican gallery denouncing it, it looks like maybe we can move towards making sure we don't test another nuclear weapon. Some important news on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The U.S., I guess, has passed, and there are some laws on the books that will allow the sanctioning of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or the president has signed an order that essentially says that, you know, any energy construction projects with Russia, are subject to being sanctioned, right? And so this has been hanging around. However, in the past, it had been like kind of explicit that European countries helping to construct the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would not be sanctioned. Well, Mike Pompeo says that is no longer the case. And while he didn't announce sanctions, I guess, the public guarantee going away is a little bit of a threat, and I guess an attempt to deter the completion of the pipeline. This pipeline is important because it'll bring the liquefied natural gas directly from Russia into Central Europe, like Germany. The idea is that would bring down energy prices quite a bit for the people who, have access to it. The U.S. doesn't like it, kind of for protectionism, mercantilist reasons of if Russia's selling them the liquefied natural gas, then the U.S. can. In the UK, I think there's a very interesting, potentially important lawsuit that has been filed. It looks like somebody who may be an Iranian soccer player, it's unclear of exactly who the person is suing Christopher Steele over the Steele dossier in UK court. Not to get too much into the tabloids, but recently there was, I think, the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. I don't follow this closely enough. Somebody pooped in somebody's bed, I hear. Story going on in the UK, and I guess some more stuff sometimes comes out in the UK because of like their libel laws. And so maybe we get some of the information behind what happened in Russiagate coming out of this UK court, as somebody is taking Steele to task for his very false dossier. The U.S. is holding large anti-China naval war games right now in the South China Sea and the surrounding area with Australia, Japan, and India. This is, quite a collection of powerful and, wealthy, I guess not necessarily the case of India, but militarily powerful or wealthy states around China who are, taking these actions with the U.S. and all together to, take an anti-China approach, as I'm sure taking, getting notice in Beijing and only adding fuel to the fire that I've been talking about on this show so much recently, especially with, guests and my colleague over at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, and Will Porter. The U.S. has also deployed some B-1B bombers to Guam. These, I guess, are seen as threats probably by both the Chinese and North Korean governments. The U.S., for the second time in 2 weeks, sent a second aircraft carrier into the South China Sea. I believe it is the USS Ronald Reagan and the USS Nimitz are the two ships that are deployed there right now. These are, massive aircraft carriers that are accompanied by a lot of other support ships and, other warships. And, these are waters seen as China as Chinese territory. Is certainly, I'm sure, very provocative and going to create a real problem in the future as, tensions wrap up with China and other places, whether it's the U.S. trying to take China to task over their treatment of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, the regular people of China who are oppressed by the CCP, the outreach in the South China Sea, the Belt and Road Initiative, the just trade war going on with China. There's so many levels that the U.S. is competing and targeting China on, that the more we, take these actions, the more likely China will take a more aggressive stance, and it could lead to a possible confrontation, again, potentially being something in the South China Sea. The U.S. has sanctioned 4 Chinese officials, claiming that they are a part of the fentanyl pandemic, or whatever they're calling it here in the U.S. It certainly is quite a problem, the number of overdose going on, and a lot of that does have to do with people who are using fentanyl mixed with or in, exchange of heroin as a stronger, drug. In the end, the solution isn't to sanction the Chinese officials, rather just end the war on drugs, to completely disempower them. And if you don't have a war on drugs, then they can't illegally sell drugs on the black market, and they don't have quite the hold and the power that they do at this point. Moving on to Afghanistan, Taliban suicide attack killed at least 8 people. The Taliban have continued their attacks although it seems specifically more targeting the Afghan government. At least at this point, no reports of U.S. troops being killed in these attacks. However, the general feeling is probably taking Afghanistan away from the situation on the ground needed to facilitate some kind of ceasefire between the Taliban and the Afghan government as the U.S. hopefully exits Afghanistan over the next few months. Although the Afghan government really isn't doing to help anything here. They've now given notorious war criminal warlord Dostum the highest rank in their military. I guess it's marshal. So that's unfortunate. This guy's a brutal war criminal. Famously, he sodomizes people with the barrels of rifles. So not the kind of guy that you would want high ranking positions of government, but that is the Afghan government that the U.S. has built for the past decade and change. There now. Israel has announced that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial will proceed in January with the calling of witnesses. They say it will be at an aggressive pace. However, moving the start of calling witnesses 6 months down the road, I would have to imagine is a victory for Netanyahu, who is essentially trying to beat these corruption charges in any way possible, including by just kicking it down the road enough till he could give himself immunity from, his own Knesset. The UK reports they carried out major special operations missions in northern Iraq against ISIS forces. A car bomb went off and killed 5 people in northeastern Syria. Of course, Turkey is blaming the Syrian YPG Kurds, but they blame the Kurds on everything. Turkey also bats some pretty radical Sunni elements in the region. It's very possible this is al-Nusra linked as well. Israel carried out several airstrikes targeting Syria's capital city of Damascus. It was unclear on casualties of my recording of this. To move on to Libya before I wrap up here, the situation is very complex geopolitically, where the typical who's on whose side doesn't necessarily make sense. So from the best I could tell, there's the Government of National Accord, which is based in Tripoli. It has the backing of the city Marista, which is a key military stronghold, and has been on the offensive in recent months and has expanded their territory quite a bit. However, if you look at a map, it seems what they control is maybe like the northeastern quarter or northwestern quarter of a fifth of Libya, whereas the Libyan National Army, which the main military power center there is Khalifa Haftar. He was a former, I guess, general or high-ranking official within Muammar Gaddafi's government, was used as the CIA in an attempted to overthrow Gaddafi way back when it didn't work. So he lived in Langley, Virginia for a while, but now he's come back to oppose that government. He gets his, I guess, political mandate from a parliament based in the eastern half of Libya, a city called Tobruk. He controls the key city of Benghazi, and then even the city of Sirte, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, but more towards central Libya. Now, the city of Sirte seems to be where the showdown is going to take place, as the Egyptian dictator al-Sisi has drawn a red line saying that if the GNA takes Sirte from the LNA, he would provide, his army to support, the GNA there. And so Egypt, has provided support to Haftar in the past in the form of airstrikes, along with the UAE, Saudi Arabia. Russia has provided support. From my understanding, Sudan has provided support, and then European countries like France as well. On the other side of this, the GNA has received support from the Qataris. At one time, I think they, were receiving support like from the U.S. and Italy, as they were the internationally UN-recognized government of Libya. Although I think that even that status is a little bit more tenuous at this point. And I don't think the U.S. or Italy really outright supports the GNA, although Turkey provides a lot of support, including their drone program and now military equipment. And so the real threat here is that you end up with Turkey and Egypt essentially squaring off, and what could start off as a little bit of a proxy fight, but escalate to just, a full Turkish-Egyptian war playing out here in Libya as these two competing governments battle for control. I think a lot of it ends up having to do with like rights and the water Mediterranean Sea territory, and then also what happens in Libya as far as oil contracts go. All right, everybody, that's the show today. Hope you're enjoying it. Make sure you share the show from the Libertarian Institute, and subscribe or follow me on Twitter now at Kyle Anzalone _. All right, thanks everyone.